Hello, and welcome to episode 75 of Prose. This week, we return to our roots in flash fiction with a reevaluation of success and a chef's plight in Limbo. As I said, these stories this week are really back to the origins of Prose. So for those that have been with us since the very beginnings of the podcast, things will feel a bit nostalgic with the short, punchy episodes today. I hope that listeners, both new and seasoned, enjoy this nod back to the show's beginnings. As usual, I implore you all to go follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, though the Instagram feed is a bit behind of late because yours truly kinda lost his phone, so I apologize for that. More will come to the feed soon. Even more amazing would be if you could head over to Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes, and leave a rating and a review for Prose. Ratings and reviews really make me smile, and they help others find our show. For easiest access to the program, subscribe using Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast catcher floats your boat. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales for this week, shall we? We have Getting Ahead and the Food. Enjoy. Getting Ahead, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. 50 hours a week for 6 years. And that's just what was on the books. Connell looked at the basket of nuts on his utterly nondescript desk. Only one personal item per desktop, you know. And cringed at the paltry peace offering that management had deigned to drop off on all the desks in his wing of the office. A half-pound of mixed nuts. Some dollar store red glittery ribbon made into a bow, probably by Sandy, that stupid suck-up bitch. No, this wasn't fair. Sandy wasn't stupid. She was a smart one, always kissing ass and doing just a bit extra to ensure that she got the plum clients to call and didn't get written up on those days she wasn't feeling up to coming in. Connell popped the top off his gift. Peanuts, honey roasted peanuts, walnuts, the occasional crumble of cashew or pecan. No Brazil nuts, his favorite. No pistachios, his second favorite. Hell, all he wanted out of this pile of bullshit, thanks, were those slivers of cashew and pecan, the latter reminding him of his childhood, picking them off the ground at his grandparents' house in Mississippi, forcing him to question why the fuck he'd ever left that bucolic paradise for this shithole city to begin with. That flight of fancy died quickly as he shouldered his coat off and slung it over the back of his chair. He knew precisely why he'd left the South. Money. Opportunity. There wasn't too much of that going around down below the Mason-Dixon. Anyone who thinks the North was magnanimous in victory never really studied the Reconstruction era. 200 years later, and the sons and daughters of both Confederate and Union man alike struggled to survive down there. Connell plopped his briefcase on his desk, unlocking the latches using the scrolling numbers on each side, as if anyone would want files from this dump. Consulting files? They were damn near useless to him. God help the poor schmuck thinking they'd scored some money or some insider information that would make them rich, should they try to steal Connell's hallowed briefcase. In truth, the only reason he carried the thing was because his mother had given it to him upon his announcing he was heading to New York City to make a name and fortune for himself. Black faux leather and a sparse feltesque inside weren't too terribly fancy, but boy did he love this old thing. Boy, did he miss his mother and his family. He shook himself to get moving. Seeing the nuts again, though, Connell's anger rose up anew. Fuck these people. Day after day, he was doomed and damned to schmooze on the phone with rich assholes that, were they to meet Connell, look down their noses at him and think of him as less than their, no doubt, frou-frou dogs that cost more than Connell's car. Cost more than Connell's entire family's cars put together. Hell, those damn hypothetical dogs probably ate better than Connell and his entire family too. Nuts. Shit. What did they even do here anyway? Consultancy? What the fuck is that? He talks to some people about their life, their business, their dreams, tells them what to do and not do. They listen to him or don't, and they pay the company for his time. And why? Because some dumbass yokel came up to the Big Apple with an unused creative writing MFA and a couple business certificates? Because said yokel could drawl and say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," real nice? He'd feel bad about fleecing these dipshits, except that these were the self-same dipshits that were keeping their metaphorical boots on the metaphorical throats of people like Connell. As had their parents, as had their grandparents, and so on for a good few generations back, surely. Again, Connell shook off the anger as best he could. This time he sat down at his desk, taking his files out of his briefcase, slapping them on the desk and placing his beloved briefcase under his desk's hollowed right side. As usual, he was here an hour early. For a place he hated, he was here a lot. For a job he hated, he was dedicated to it. He just couldn't allow himself to do subpar work. In fact, that's something the bosses loved about him. They called it his farm boy work ethic. He'd work himself nearly to death to chase down a lead, to please a client, to please them, whatever. His granddad had told him to never leave something half done, and though he was thousands of miles away from those weeping willows and piles of kudzu and blackberry bushes and unending buckets of love, he held fast to his granddad's advice. Connell looked at the clock again. The hour had quickly turned into 3/4 of an hour early because of all this sentiment. He shook his head yet again and picked up the phone. None of the other businesses would be open right now, but he could leave them voicemails and follow-up emails, letting them and everyone else know that he was a step ahead of them, that he was a hard worker, pushing to get ahead. He reached over to the open nut container and grabbed a handful with his left hand, tossing a few into his waiting craw. Yep, voicemail. Swallow. Bullshit a message for about 2 minutes. Hang up. These nuts were terrible. He reached over and grabbed another handful with his left hand, dialing his next call with his right. Thank you for listening to Getting Ahead, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. The music that you hear in the background comes from freemusicarchive.com. It's a fantastic service, and you really should go check it out sometime. This track is being used under a CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication license. Next up this week, we have another short story, getting back to our roots with flash fiction as I mentioned in the introduction. The next story this week is The Food. The Food, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Giuseppe lived chiefly in the past anymore. Then again, that was true of almost everyone in Limbo. The present was relatively bland. Gray heaped upon gray. Eternity spanning out. An eternity of nothing too terribly bad and nothing too terribly good. True and utter nothingness. Many would consider this a gift. There were plenty of people that had been cut off from limbo, their bad deeds damning them to the molten hills and biting cold and oddly specific punishments. He should be somewhat thankful for his nothingness. The alternative that he had laid out before him was, to be sure, hellish. Torment after torment, stretching out into infinity. The oddity here was that the very nature of Limbo caused the interactions of its denizens to take on an odd, hollow quality that Giuseppe was already accustomed to. If nature begat culture, then Limbo ensured that the weather, or the lack thereof, the daily doings, or the lack thereof, and the latest gossip, or the lack thereof, became the conversations he needed to endure. Truly, though, this was no different than his daily life before death. Unlike many in Limbo, this was a slice of home gifted him by God. In life, when Giuseppe was not chopping vegetables, doubling various recipes to stretch the outcome to handle a forthcoming heavy dine-out night in his town, or generally sharing his culinary gifts with the world, he was enduring this same drivel from the masses of the world. Everyone always wanted to speak with the chef. This was terribly common at every decent restaurant across the globe, and his was no exception. Diners were even more keen to leap onto discussions of an amendment to any addendums that the owners would toss on the menu. These last-minute shifts to earlier last-minute changes were obnoxious to the chef and his crew, but the owners could care less. They could care even less that Giuseppe was doomed to schmooze with all the sheep eating in their establishment. It was downright painful. Giuseppe would give anything now for that pain, though. These repetitive tubs of drivel that made up his every moment of every day. He didn't sleep, so there was no end. He didn't get to end his shift, so there was no end. Gray heaped upon gray. Eternity yawning out, never ending. What he wouldn't give for something, anything, to jolt them all out of this. He was also a bit unsure what hell might have held for him. As a chef, food was Giuseppe's life. Now, he had only vague memories of what food tasted like, what a full stomach felt like, what the smiles on customers' faces looked like. But here in Limbo, he actually could still cook. The problem was that when a ghostly chef cooked for other shades, it was pointless. They don't need or want the sustenance. The art that was his food turned gray and lumpy when it touched a plate. The smells disappeared and dissipated before they reached their non-corporeal spirit noses, and the tastes? They might as well have eaten dust and ash. There was no taste, there was no texture. The food was not food, and his gift was worthless in this place. If this is what eternity was like in Limbo, hell must be so far beyond anything Giuseppe could begin to think up that he was loath to continue trying. That was the thing about his thoughts in Limbo too. They seemed to disappear just beyond grasp, making him quite forgetful about anything in what served as the now. The past was ever present, though, torturing him in this bland nothing sphere. The only thing that would occasionally break the monotony was a strange rumble that Giuseppe perceived as thunder. The only comparison he knew to make, a fragment from his past on Earth. The rumbling would come from some indistinguishable up that escaped his and the other Limbo residents' understanding or observation. They would hear it, feel it coming from the relative above, and they would briefly ponder on what those in heaven might be doing that caused such an exciting ruckus. But that fire in their bellies would disappear, and their thoughts would push away from grasping and pondering, and they would forget that the thunder ever had rolled through it all. Giuseppe lived chiefly in the past anymore. Then again, that was true of almost everyone in Limbo. The present was relatively bland. Gray heaped upon gray. Eternity spanning out, an eternity of nothing too terribly bad and nothing too terribly good. True and utter nothingness. Thank you for listening to The Food. The sounds you hear in the background are actually original sound effects for this particular short story, something that we here at Prose are trying to try our hands at. Again, as we promised many months ago, I'm really hoping to get some more original music and original sound effects coming your way as soon as possible. That does it this week for Prose. I truly hope that you enjoyed our little foray back into short flash fiction. It makes for a shorter episode, but many of you had wondered why we veered away from that path in the first place. So, I thought I'd give you that taste of the old days. As always, I hope that you'll love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time for the next episode of Prose.